In March 2019, a man who once had 50,000 people chanting his name at St. James Park walked out of Newcastle United for the last time. No farewell tour, no tribute video, no open letter from the board thanking him for a decade of service on the pitch and years more on the touchline. Just silence. A statement nobody wanted to write about a legend nobody wanted to talk about. And when the real reason finally surfaced, it had nothing to do with results, contracts, or boardroom politics. It was about what he'd been saying to teenagers in a training ground changing room. 10 months later, an independent FA panel would attach 3 words to his name that no one in the Northeast ever expected to hear about a Newcastle hero. Obviously racist. This is the story of Peter Beardsley, and it is not the story most people think it is. Here are the numbers first because they matter. 326 appearances for Newcastle United. A league title with Liverpool. 59 caps for England. A World Cup squad member. One half of arguably the most loved strike partnership in Newcastle's modern history. That's the player. Now here's the coach, found guilty by an independent football association commission of racially abusing his own academy players. Kids as young as 17. Kids in his care. Kids who trusted him with their future in the game. Calling one of them a monkey. Telling African origin players on a group outing that they should be used to being compared to apes while climbing trees. Questioning whether a black teenager was lying about his own age. Leaning on a stereotype so old and so ugly that most clubs had stopped tolerating it decades earlier. Let's be clear about what actually happened here, because Newcastle United wasn't clear about it. Not for 14 months. Rewind, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. Peter Beardsley didn't arrive at the top of English football. He clawed his way there, one rejection at a time. Born in Newcastle, working class through and through, he was turned away by his own hometown club as a teenager. The ultimate hometown snub, before he'd even had the chance to wear the shirt. Other clubs passed on him too. While kids his age were signing schoolboy forms and dreaming on YKS wages, Beardsley was clocking in at a factory, playing part-time football on the side, wondering whether the professional game was ever going to happen for him at all. It's the kind of underdog backstory football documentaries love. The boy nobody wanted who became a legend. But it's also the kind of backstory that quietly explains something much darker about what came decades later. Because the football culture Beardsley broke into wasn't gentle. Not even close. At Carlisle United, and then at Manchester United under the old-school regime of that era, changing rooms ran on hierarchy, humiliation, and fear. Bullying wasn't treated as a scandal. It was treated as a coaching method. Senior professionals ran the room like a court, and young players either fell in line or got broken down until they did. That wasn't the exception. That was the culture, character building, they called it. Beardsley came up entirely inside that system. He absorbed it as normal, the way anyone does when it's all they've ever known. And crucially, as we'll get to, nobody ever asked him to unlearn it. He found his best football away from all of that noise in the more expressive, looser environment of North American soccer, where his game genuinely flourished for the first time. Then he came home, and this is where the legend really begins. He linked up with Kevin Keegan at Newcastle in a partnership fans still talk about with something close to reverence. Two forwards who seemed to read each other's minds on instinct alone. He moved to Liverpool for what was then a club record fee, won the league title, became one of the most technically gifted and beloved attacking players of his generation. 59 England caps, a World Cup, pundits of the era, the Nevilles, the Wrights, the Klopps who'd go on to shape the next generations of the English game, have spoken about Beardsley for years the way people speak about players who made football look like art. It's the kind of career that, in most cities, gets you a statue. Think about the actual scale of what he achieved on the pitch, because it makes the rest of this story land even harder. A First Division title with Liverpool during one of the club's most dominant eras. 2 separate spells at Newcastle, either side of everywhere else, because the club and its fans simply couldn't let go of him. A move to Everton later in his career that somehow made him beloved on both sides of Stanley Park at once. A genuinely rare feat in a rivalry defined by not sharing anything, let alone affection. Nearly 60 caps for his country at a time, when that shirt meant something close to sacred. This isn't a case of a mediocre player getting a pass because of nostalgia. This is one of the most gifted footballers of his generation, and that's exactly why nobody wanted to look too closely at what he might be doing once the camera stopped rolling and he swapped his boots for a tracksuit and a coaching lanyard. There's something else worth sitting with here before we move on. The dressing room culture Beardsley came up in wasn't some isolated quirk of one club or one decade. Ask almost any player who came through an English academy system in the 1970s or 80s, and you'll hear some version of the same story. Humiliation dressed up as discipline, cruelty dressed up as banter, and absolutely no one in charge who thought to question whether any of it was actually necessary to produce good footballers. It produced good footballers anyway, plenty of them, Beardsley included. That's precisely the problem. When the method works, on some surface level, nobody stops to ask what it costs the people it's used on, or what happens when the people who survived it end up in charge of the next generation. And that reputation, that adoration, is the hinge the entire rest of this story turns on. Because when Beardsley retired and moved into youth coaching at Newcastle, nobody was watching him the way they'd watch an ordinary member of staff. He wasn't ordinary. He was Peter Beardsley, a club legend, shaping the next generation of Newcastle players in his own image. Who questions a man like that? Who dares to? Here's where it gets uncomfortable and where the pattern actually starts. In 2003, two youth players, plus a related complaint touching Academy director Kenny Wharton, accused Beardsley of bullying. A Premier League inquiry followed. He was cleared. As far as the club was concerned, that was the end of it. Case closed, box ticked, business as usual. But cleared is not the same thing as examined. Nobody sat down afterward and asked the harder question, whether Beardsley's methods, his language, his old-school idea of toughening kids up actually needed to change. The complaint was investigated, dismissed, and quietly filed away in a drawer somewhere, while Beardsley kept coaching exactly as he had before. Same voice, same habits, same era of football stuck in his head, transplanted straight into a changing room full of 21st century teenagers. Zoom out for a second, and the timing matters too. In 2016, English football was rocked by a wave of historic abuse allegations that swept across multiple clubs and academies, eventually triggering a nationwide inquiry into how youth football had handled safeguarding for decades. Suddenly, how did this happen and why did nobody say anything wasn't a hypothetical question anymore? It was the question the entire sport was being forced to confront publicly all at once. Beardsley's case landed right in the middle of that reckoning. The Gibson complaint, remember, was 2016. The Ben Elmhany complaint was 2018. Newcastle wasn't operating in some information vacuum where nobody understood the stakes of ignoring these allegations. The rest of English football was learning that lesson in real time, and Newcastle still took 14 months to act on their own. Let me be fair for a second, because this story genuinely isn't as simple as one bad man in an otherwise clean sport. When Newcastle later reinstated Beardsley into coaching roles, they did it without updating his qualifications, without putting him through modern safeguarding training, without diversity and inclusion education that, by the 2010s, most professional academies were treating as baseline, non-negotiable requirements for anyone working with minors. That is not purely a Beardsley failure. That is an institutional one, a club that let nostalgia do the job oversight was supposed to do, year after year, complaint after complaint. But fairness only stretches so far, and here's where the case against him piles up fast. By 2016, Academy player Lewis Gibson, a genuine talent, one of the club's brightest young prospects, had filed a bullying complaint against Beardsley. It reached a grievance procedure meeting. It resolved nothing. Disillusioned, 17-year-old Gibson left for Everton within months. And within 3 months of that move, Gibson had won an U17 World Cup with England. Newcastle didn't just fail to protect a player from an alleged bullying campaign. They lost a genuine, proven talent because of it and barely blinked in response. Then, in January 2018, it happened again. Except this time, it didn't quietly disappear into a drawer. Academy midfielder Yassine Ben Elmhany, 22 years old, filed a formal complaint of bullying and racism. And crucially, he wasn't alone this time. Up to 5 of his teammates came forward with supporting witness statements, backing his account. Newcastle finally, belatedly, opened an internal investigation. It took 14 months. 14 months of gardening leave. 14 months of silence from a club that had known about pattern complaints against this coach since 2003. Beardsley left Newcastle in March 2019, and the club still, to this day, has never published what its own internal investigation actually found. Think about what 14 months actually means for the people involved. It means a 22-year-old midfielder who'd already left the club for it, waiting over a year to find out whether the institution he trusted would even take his word seriously. It means teammates who backed his account carrying on training, day after day, inside the same club, not knowing whether speaking up would end their own careers before they'd started. It means Beardsley himself, on gardening leave on full pay for over a year, while the club that employed him decided how to handle what he'd allegedly done. Whatever you think about due process, and due process matters, 14 months of institutional silence is its own kind of message about whose comfort actually came first. That's when the FA stepped in, and this is where the real reveal lands. The FA charged Beardsley with 3 counts under Rule E3, using abusive and insulting language, aggravated by explicit reference to race and ethnic origin. Not one isolated incident. 3, spanning years, spanning multiple victims, spanning a pattern the club had every opportunity to catch and chose not to. The Commission's findings, published in September 2019, are worth hearing in full because they don't fit neatly into either the beloved hero's story or the simple villain story fans wanted to tell themselves. The panel found Beardsley guilty on all 3 charges. Calling a black player a monkey during a game of head tennis in the training ground. Telling players of African origin on a team-building trip to an adventure park that they should be used to comparisons to primates while climbing. Suggesting a 17-year-old African origin player was lying about his own age. Leaning directly on the racist stereotype that black players falsify their age for advantage. The panel's own language called the remarks obviously racist and wholly unacceptable. And here's the twist that actually explains everything that came before it. The same panel that found him guilty of 3 counts of racial abuse also said something that complicates the entire narrative. They did not believe Beardsley was motivated by racial hatred. They believed, and this is the uncomfortable, tangled truth sitting at the center of this whole story, that he had simply never been taught otherwise. He came up inside a football culture from decades earlier where this kind of banter was currency, unquestioned and unpunished. Nobody at Newcastle ever properly sat him down and updated him. Not after the 2003 complaint. Not in the 15 years since. His reputation did the job that mandatory training was supposed to do. It insulated him from scrutiny. It let habits that should have died out with the culture of the 1980s survive, completely unchallenged, into a changing room full of teenagers in 2016 and 2017. That is the real villain of this story, and it is not just one man standing alone. It is a club that let a legend coach for over a decade without the kind of accountability an unknown and proven coach would have faced from day one. It is an institution that investigated a bullying claim in 2003, cleared him, and never once asked the deeper question of why the claim existed in the first place. It is a safeguarding culture that wrote glossy letters to parents about stringent protections while quietly letting a repeat complaint issue fester, unresolved, for well over a decade. The real climax of this story isn't the ban itself. It's the sentence the FA panel wrote to justify handing it down. That it was particularly important at a time when racism in football is prevalent that remarks of the kind made by Mr. Beardsley are punished severely. Not because Beardsley alone was the disease infecting the sport, because every club watching needed the message loud and clear. Reputation does not buy you immunity from consequences, no matter how many trophies sit in your cabinet. Beardsley, through his lawyers, said he was surprised and disappointed by the ruling, maintaining he wasn't racist and pointing to what he called serious flaws in a disciplinary process that placed the burden of proof on him rather than his accusers. It's worth noting he wasn't alone in raising concerns about how the process unfolded, but the panel weighed those objections and still returned a unanimous guilty finding on all 3 charges, which tells you how strong the underlying evidence actually was. Kick It Out took the opposite position, publicly calling on Newcastle to finally release its own internal findings and clarify exactly why he'd really left the club. The organization didn't mince words about what was at stake, arguing that a legendary playing career had no bearing whatsoever on whether the conduct itself was acceptable, and that punishment and education were the only real answers to the problem. To this day, that internal report has never been made public. The institution that let this drag on for over a decade still hasn't fully accounted for its own role in letting it happen. And until it does, lessons learned remains a phrase Newcastle has said far more often than it's actually demonstrated. So where does Beardsley actually end up in all this? A 32-week ban from all football-related activity, a mandated face-to-face education course, the training that, ironically, should have arrived a decade and a half earlier, back when the first complaint landed in 2003. Coaching opportunities that quietly dried up in the years since, including a semi-professional role that reportedly fell through once his history resurfaced. A legendary playing career that is now permanently attached in every headline search to the word racism. Not because a mob decided to cancel a hero on a whim, because an independent FA panel, after due process and a lengthy hearing, found the allegations proven 3 separate times on 3 separate charges. By 2022, 3 years after leaving Newcastle, Beardsley was still trying to find his way back into the game at the semi-professional level, and even that reportedly fell through once his history resurfaced in the process. That's the long tail of a verdict like this. It isn't just a headline that fades after a week. It follows a person into every job application, every interview, every attempt to rebuild for years afterward. Whatever sympathy you have for a man who genuinely may not have understood the time how harmful his words were, that sympathy has to sit alongside the plain fact that the harm happened anyway, to real young players, regardless of what was or wasn't in Beardsley's heart when he said it. Here's the part of this story that actually matters going forward, more than any individual verdict. Yassine Ben Elmhani was 22 years old, with nowhere near the standing of a club icon, when he filed the complaint against a Newcastle legend. Lewis Gibson was 17 when he tried and failed to get the same institution to listen 2 years earlier. These were not easy complaints to make against a man with statue-level status inside a club that had already cleared him once before, back in 2003. But they made them anyway. Multiple players backed each other up when it would have been far easier to stay quiet and protect their own careers. And slowly, painfully, over 14 agonizing months, the system that had failed them for over a decade was finally forced to actually listen. That's the uncomfortable, unglamorous truth sitting underneath this entire story. It was never really about whether Peter Beardsley is, at his core, a good man or a bad man. It's about how easily institutions let legendary status substitute for oversight, and how long that protection can quietly outlast the very people it's supposed to protect. Newcastle United didn't fail because one coach happened to carry outdated views into the 2010s. They failed because nobody with actual power was willing to challenge him, complaint after complaint, until a group of players with almost no power forced their hand. There's a wider pattern here, too, if you zoom out. Beardsley's case became one of a handful in English football's academy system that pushed clubs toward genuinely overhauling safeguarding standards, rather than just paying lip service to them in a parent's newsletter. It's part of why legendary status is treated with a little more suspicion in dressing rooms today than it was a decade ago. Progress, when it comes, rarely comes from the top down in these stories. It comes from young players deciding the risk of speaking up is finally worth taking. And it's worth saying plainly, this took genuine courage. Ben Elmhani wasn't just accusing a coach. He was accusing a Newcastle icon in a city where that name still opens doors and closes them, In an industry where young players already have almost no leverage against senior figures who control their next contract, their next loan move, their next shot at a professional career at all. The easier path, by a wide margin, would have been to say nothing and hope things got better. He didn't take the easier path. Neither did the teammates who backed him. Neither did Lewis Gibson 2 years earlier, even though his complaint didn't get the outcome it should have. Every one of these players took on real professional risk to say something that, at the time, the institution around them wasn't obviously prepared to hear. That's ultimately what separates this story from a simple morality tale about one man's fall from grace. The headline write-up almost always frames stories like this as legend disgraced, clean, simple, over in one news cycle. But the actual story took 16 years to unfold, from that first dismissed complaint in 2003 to the final FA ruling in 2019. 16 years is not one bad moment. 16 years is a system built one dismissed complaint and one unquestioned reputation at a time. And systems like that don't fix themselves. They only get fixed when someone with far less power than the man at the center decides the risk of speaking up is finally worth it. One more thing before we get to what you think. It would be easy to walk away from this story feeling like the takeaway is simple. Believe the players, distrust the institution, move on to the next scandal. But the harder, more useful takeaway is this. The exact same protective instinct that shielded Beardsley for 16 years is still sitting inside every club that has a beloved figure on the payroll right now. Nostalgia is not a safeguarding policy. A trophy cabinet is not a background check. The next version of this story is already unfolding somewhere, quietly, behind a reputation nobody wants to question. So here's the question I actually want you to sit with. When a legend crosses the line like this, is it fair to hold the institution around him just as responsible as the man himself? Or does spreading the blame around let him off too easy? Drop your take in the comments below. I read every single one. A like genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. And subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the stories football would rather you forgot about. Football at this scale is never just a tournament, and it's never just a career. It's a moment in time.